Our first speaker in this second session is Christopher Anderson from the University of Washington. Christopher's field is ecology, and Christopher's advised by Professor Barry Brosi. Completed the practicum at the National Laboratory of the Rockies in 2024. Christopher's going to tell us about using multi-objective optimization to reveal driving forces behind mutualistic community structure. So, Christopher, please take it away.
All right, great. Hello, everybody. I'm Chris. I'm a PhD student at the University of Washington, and I'm here today to talk to you about one of my recent projects that uses HPC, specifically using multi-objective optimization to reveal the driving forces behind mutualistic community structure. So I am a community ecologist, which means I study biology at the level of entire communities of interacting organisms. So I'm interested in understanding how ecosystems and populations change over time because of those interactions. And I study this using a blend of empirical and computational methods. Specifically, I study plant-pollinator interactions. So pollination is the process by which pollen is transferred from individual plants, thereby facilitating reproduction. So this is a notable interaction because it is an example of a mutualism, which is where both organisms benefit from the interaction. So the animal pollinators receive nectar and pollen that they use to feed their young, whereas, once again, the plants receive pollination services which allow them to reproduce. So if I'm interested in understanding how a meadow of wildflowers is going to change over time, I need to understand all of the pollination interactions that happen in this meadow. And because nothing in biology or in nature is particularly simple, things can start to get really complex when we take into account the entire web of interactions that are happening here. And so, like any good scientist, when you're confronted with complexity, ecologists have decided to abstract it and reduce these interactions down to a matrix. So just showing who is actually interacting with whom and kind of how strong those interactions are. And because we have, reduced this complexity to a matrix, that means we get to do all sorts of fun math with it in order to understand how these ecosystems might change over time. And so kind of using this paradigm, ecologists have learned a lot about ecological networks, and I would like to make a few remarks about those. The first is that through a lot of different levels of biological organization, a lot of different ecosystems, we have learned that these networks are not random. And correspondingly, we see that there's predictable structure that you see in these networks across a lot of different contexts. For example, you'll see nestedness in mutualistic networks, and I'll explain a little bit more what that means later. And so even though we are often working with a matrix, this kind of static snapshot of the community, it's important to remember that these aren't the reality of the situation. These exist in a space, they exist across time. The species composition might change over time through invasive species, local extirpation, things like that. And it's also important to remember that these networks need to serve the organisms that comprise them. So they need to be both functional and stable across time. And so kind of using these observations as a foundation, a lot of scientists have asked, or have been curious about whether or not these networks themselves actually evolve over time. So we know that the organisms that comprise these networks are subject to evolution, but we're curious if the actual configuration of these interactions evolve over time and trend towards more functional and stable configurations. And so what this might look like over time is something like this, where And community is assembled from a metapopulation. There are patterns of interactions, and from those patterns of interactions, there are stable and functional configurations. And then there are some that are intrinsically unstable, and those disappear over time. So over an evolutionary time scale, you only end up with the stable configurations. So one of these common configurations that you see in mutualistic networks is known as nestedness, which is a structure characterized by specialists interacting with subsets of who the generalists interact with. So here we can see the first pollinator here interacts with every single one of these plants, and there are increasingly specialized pollinators under here. And this is particularly remarkable because this is seen over and over again in empirical studies of these networks. But this is weird. This is a really unexpected and weird structure just from basic ecological theory. In a lot of ways, this maximizes competition, which is not what you would expect to see in these networks. And like once again, using that hypothesis that networks evolve over time and tend to bias toward more stable and functional configurations, nestedness is also unexpected in that it isn't particularly good at anything. It's not good at any of these measures of stability that we typically look at. But that's maybe not necessarily a death sentence for nestedness. So we perhaps shouldn't expect a configuration in nature to be perfectly optimized for any one measure of stability. So once again, these networks exist in time and space, and they are subject to many different pressures all at once. So environmental variability, demographic stochasticity, general ennui. There's a lot of things that these communities are dealing with at any given time. And so we perhaps shouldn't expect any configuration to be perfectly suited for any one measure, and should instead be reasonably good at withstanding a lot of different pressures. And indeed, we can already see that there are trade-offs in two of the most common measures of stability that are used to measure these communities. So local dynamical stability, and this is like the classic dynamical stability that you'll hear about, many of you have heard about in dynamical systems. And there's also robustness to coextinction, so the ability of a network to resist secondary extinctions if a single node was removed. We know that these are inversely related to one another through connectance. So local stability wants a very sparsely connected network, whereas robustness wants those redundancies, so it wants a more connected network. So with all of that in mind, the project that we're working on here is really asking the question, if we were to just optimize these networks based on multiple measures of stability, do they look different from those that are optimized on a single measure of stability? And more importantly, do they end up looking more like the empirical networks that we actually see in nature? So before I get into it, I want to just talk about what exactly the artifact that we're optimizing for here. And so this is the community matrix, which you should interpret as the Jacobian of the system of equations that govern the populations of these organisms. So each entry here is the average effect of species A on average B, their growth rates. And once again, because we're working with mutualistic networks, we have the kind of mutualistic quadrants, where the interactions are positive, the competitive antagonistic quadrants, as well as the self-regulation diagonal. So these are the constraints that the species exert on their own species, their growth. So I have written a custom evolutionary algorithm to explore this question. And so So again, I'm a biologist, and so a lot of problems end up looking like nails that can be solved with an evolution-shaped hammer. And I also wanted this to kind of gesture towards the natural process that we think is happening here. And so we have tried to optimize on several different measures of stability here: local stability, robustness, resilience, and reactivity. Those are combined into a scalar. And then once again, I decided to write my own algorithm here so that the matrix generation and all the mutations adhere to ecological rules. That being said, this is fairly straightforward. The algorithm, we generate some ecologically realistic networks. We evaluate and sort them based on our objective function. We take the highest performing networks, we mutate them, and then have a new generation of those mutated children. So this is all reasonably well optimized and parallelized where it can be, but this evaluation step is the real bottleneck here. Robustness in particular is a simulation, so you have to randomly delete nodes to see how robust the network is, whereas the other measures you can just extract from the eigenvalue, and that's fairly easy to do with the size of these networks. So your question might be, does this work? And my answer is, I think so. And so this is a good example of what one of these runs looks like. So we have generation on the x-axis, y-axis is our target metric. And you can see it does go up and to the right over time. So let's look at some results here. And so here is the outcome of running this process for many, many thousands of different weighting combinations for that composite metric. And as we can see here, it looks like we have a nice convex Pareto front here, where some of the kind of most optimized on the dominant real eigenvalue and robustness are over here to the right. But critically, I think what's exciting to see or expected is that we have nothing up here that are perfectly optimized for both local stability, just from the eigenvalue, as well as robustness. But what about our other question, which is, do these end up looking more like empirical networks? And what about our old friend nestedness? So we're zooming in now on just the locally stable configurations, because these could be considered the more biologically and ecologically relevant. And so here we have it scattered on the same axes here with the dominant real eigenvalue. More stable over here, then more robust up here. And the color here is nestedness. And what we can see is that there is some structure here, but what is exciting is that nestedness is kind of distributed throughout, although there does seem to be a relationship between nestedness and robustness. And indeed, if we then scatter this by robustness and nestedness, we see that there is a nice correlation here. So once again, I'm an ecologist, so if I see something that looks like this, that is a strong correlation. What is exciting about this is that what this tells me is that nestedness helps modulate stability and robustness. So among this cohort of locally stable configurations, we can perhaps get more robust networks by assuming a more nested configuration. And something that really excites me about this is that this is somewhat expected from some previous theory that has been done in this area, but if this result holds, this is going to be one of the first times that we've seen nestedness kind of emerge spontaneously. So we're optimizing on these other metrics, but nestedness still shows up as perhaps an optimal solution to these trade-offs. And so nestedness might end up being something like a evolutionary spandrel in this case, so something that's not necessarily selected for, but still comes along for the ride as other things are selected for. So this is still some work in progress, and there's a lot of things that I would like to add here, including some more ways to calculate robustness, as well as some feasibility, making sure that if I were to put a functional form behind this, that all of the populations remain positive over time, as well as needing to go into much larger networks. 100 by 100 is not unheard of. And so I've said that, I'm doing multi-objective optimization, but I do condense it down into a scalar. I would like to do some more true multi-objective explorations here to really make sure that I am finding the real Pareto front for a lot of these metrics. Big thank you to everybody, all my collaborators, the lab, as well as everybody that I've ever done field work with, everybody at Krell. This is an incredible fellowship, one that I feel very lucky to have been a part of. I'm, just an old bee wrangler, and being able to do things like multi-objective optimization or building automated remote monitoring of pollinators using machine learning to identify insects has just been a dream come true. So really, thank you to CSGF, thank you to Krell, and thank you to all of you as well.